The hallway of Fairview Middle School in the suburbs of Chicago buzzed with the hum of voices. Students rushed to classes, slamming locker doors and chatting with each other. The air smelled of dust, paper, and a faint scent of cleaning solution, the familiar smell of school routine. Room 207, located at the end of the long hallway, was filled with seventh graders who lazily took their seats, exchanging jokes and complaints about the upcoming math class. At the back desk, as always, sat Claire Hopkins. Slightly hunched, with long blonde hair tied in a simple ponytail, she quickly flipped through the pages of her notebook as if checking something before class. Large glasses hid her expressive eyes, which, if anyone dared to look into them, seemed too mature for her age. At 12, Claire had learned to blend into her surroundings like a chameleon. She spoke only when necessary and tried to avoid any situations where she might be the center of attention. Teachers rarely noticed her. Claire was invisible, a student who always turned in her assignments on time, but never stood out. However, her notebooks held a secret. On the margins, in neat lines, were complex mathematical formulas, equations, and problems that clearly went beyond the middle school curriculum. Mathematics was her world, her secret haven, where she could feel confident and free. Mrs. Carter, the math teacher, entered the classroom with an unusually loud click of her heels. Tall, with short chestnut hair, she was a strict but fair woman. Her reputation as an educator was well known. She did not tolerate laziness or mediocrity. Mrs. Carter's gaze swept across the classroom, revealing a mix of irritation and disappointment. "Stop chattering," she said sharply, placing a stack of papers on the desk. Her voice was clear, almost metallic, like the sharp ring of a gong. The noise immediately subsided. She held up one of the worksheets for everyone to see. "This is basic algebra," she began, her gaze cold. "And yet, half of you can't handle it." "Half," she repeated, emphasizing the last word. "How do you plan to get into colleges if you can't even handle the basics now?" A heavy silence hung in the classroom. Some students averted their eyes, pretending to write something in their notebooks. Others just squirmed uncomfortably in their seats. Claire continued to look at her notebook, pretending to recheck her assignments. She knew that if she stayed still, she could remain unnoticed. But Mrs. Carter was not one to miss details. She walked around the classroom, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. Her sharp gaze lingered on each student a little longer than they would have liked. "You will see problems like these on every test from now until college," she continued. "If you don't learn to solve them now, you will struggle not only on exams but also in real life." Her voice increased the tension in the room, like a taut string. She stopped at her desk, crossing her arms. "Enough pretending. We need to start working. And to check how well you actually understand the material, let's see who is ready to demonstrate their knowledge right now." She quickly scanned the classroom, her gaze stopping at the back desk where Claire sat. "Miss Hopkins," Mrs. Carter called, her voice cutting through the silence like a clap of thunder. Claire's head jerked up, her heart raced, and an unpleasant feeling settled in her stomach, like a cold lump. All eyes instantly turned to her, making her feel as if she were under a spotlight. She nervously swallowed and, trying to maintain her composure, barely audibly replied, "Yes, ma'am." "You're sitting so quietly. Let's see if you were listening. Come to the board," the teacher said, gesturing toward the blackboard. Claire felt her feet rooted to the floor. Her first impulse was to stay put, but she knew that would only make things worse. She stood up, trying not to look at her classmates, and walked toward the board. Mrs. Carter took a piece of chalk and, with a clear challenge, wrote an equation that stretched across the entire board. It was a complex example, more like a university-level puzzle than a seventh-grade problem. A soft whisper spread through the classroom. "What is this horror?" someone muttered quietly. "She won't be able to handle it," Claire heard. The voices surrounded her like shadows. Mrs. Carter turned around and looked at the girl coldly. "Solve it," she said curtly. Claire stood in front of the board, feeling the weight of the entire class's expectations. Her fingers gripped the chalk tighter. She understood. This moment would define her path. Claire stood before the board, feeling the weight of the entire class's attention bearing down on her shoulders. The air was thick with tension, heavy and sticky like fog. Her gaze scanned the equation, a long chain of symbols that seemed designed to confuse and overwhelm. The whispers of her classmates echoed in the background. Doubts, mockery, anticipation of her failure. She took a deeper breath, trying to drown out the growing noise in her head. Mrs. Carter's sharp gaze pierced her from the desk, like a knife. "Well, are we going to stand here all day?" The teacher tossed out with a hint of mockery. That tone struck something inside Claire. Her fingers gripped the chalk tighter, white dust falling to the floor. She slowly raised her hand and made the first mark on the board. The symbols and numbers began to come to life. At first, her movements were cautious. She broke the equation into parts, focusing on each variable, as if checking each action multiple times in her mind. The chalk scratched softly on the board, leaving clear lines behind, and the room fell into complete silence. Even the noisiest students watched without blinking. "What is she doing?" whispered a girl in the front row. "This is some nonsense," added a boy next to her. But Claire didn't hear them. Her world had narrowed down to the board and the equation, as if everything else had disappeared. The symbols aligned into logical chains, the solution taking shape. She wasn't just solving a problem, she was transforming it into an ordered system that only she understood. By the midpoint of the equation, doubts began to turn into admiration. The whispering stopped as if on command. Students exchanged glances, their eyes darting between Claire and the board. What they had thought impossible was suddenly becoming a reality. Mrs. Carter, standing by her desk, initially watched with a mocking smirk, but her expression gradually changed. She straightened up, her eyes narrowing as she began to intently follow each of the girls' actions. "Is she doing it right?" someone asked uncertainly. "This is impossible," another whispered. Claire, however, seemed not to notice anything. Her movements became faster and more confident. She paused to check the final step. The lines of the equation, which intimidated her classmates, were just a puzzle to her, and she already had the key in her hands. Finally, she made the last stroke and circled the answer. The board was filled with symbols, but there was order in them. Claire put the chalk back in the tray and stepped back, surveying her work. The room froze. Mrs. Carter slowly approached the board, her heels thudding dully on the floor. She took the chalk, her face concentrated as she began to check each line. Her fingers followed the numbers, occasionally pausing, as if searching for a mistake. But there was none. "This is correct," she finally said, and her voice shattered the tense silence. The class gasped. "What? How is this possible?" Whispers echoed. Some students began to clap, awkwardly and briefly, but it was enough for Claire to feel a wave of heat rush to her cheeks. She wasn't used to applause. Mrs. Carter turned to the girl. Her gaze was different now. There was no mockery or irritation. There was genuine interest and respect. "Claire," she said slowly, "how did you do that?" Claire felt the teacher's gaze piercing her soul. She nervously adjusted her glasses and muttered, "I just broke the problem down into parts." It helped. "Did you learn this on your own?" Mrs. Carter asked, her eyebrows raised in surprise. Claire nodded, her voice a bit louder. "Yes, ma'am. I like math." The class whispered again, but this time there was no mockery in the whispers. It was awe. Some students looked at Claire with newfound respect, others with disbelief. Mrs. Carter straightened up, gave one last look at the board, and then turned to the class. "Remember this moment," she said firmly. "This is what you should aspire to. She did work that is currently beyond your reach, but that doesn't mean you can't learn. Claire," she turned back to the girl, "you have an incredible gift." Claire didn't know what to say. Her gaze darted between the teacher and her classmates. This was a new, unfamiliar world for her, where she stood not in the shadows but in the spotlight. She simply nodded, lowering her head. But something inside her had changed. She could feel it. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, students began to gather their things. The hum of voices filled the classroom, but this time it was subdued. Classmates were still discussing what had happened. Some glanced at Claire, others whispered, clearly discussing her unexpected success. Claire, still sitting at her desk, tried not to look at anyone. Her thoughts wandered, returning to the board, the equation, the moment when she first felt seen. Her fingers still felt the cold of the chalk, and her head echoed with a hum of applause that seemed to belong to another life. "Claire," Mrs. Carter's voice rose above the noise. "Stay for a moment." The classroom fell silent. Some students lingered by the door, casting curious glances, but the teacher added, "The rest of you, hurry up. You have your next class." A whisper spread through the room again before the students began to leave. Someone turned around curiously. Others tried to encourage Claire with quiet words. "That was awesome. You're a real star, Hopkins." She didn't know how to react, so she just nodded, nervously smiling. When the classroom emptied, she finally looked up at Mrs. Carter. The teacher stood by her desk, her arms crossed, her expression softer than usual. She looked not like a strict educator, but like someone genuinely interested in the conversation. "Have a seat," Mrs. Carter offered, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Claire reluctantly approached and sat down, clutching her notebook tightly. Her gaze was downcast, but she felt the teacher's intense stare. "You surprised me today," Mrs. Carter began. Her voice was soft, lacking its usual sharpness. "And I must admit, I underestimated you." Claire looked up, her eyes filled with doubt. "You underestimated me?" "Yes," the teacher honestly replied. "I assumed you were just doing what was necessary to stay in the shadows. You didn't ask questions, didn't raise your hand. I thought you were trying not to stand out." Claire nervously adjusted her glasses. I really was trying to be unnoticed. It seemed easier that way." Mrs. Carter leaned in slightly, her gaze attentive. "But why? With a talent like yours, why do you prefer to stay in the shadows?" Claire hesitated. She took a long time to find the words, not knowing how to express what she had always felt. "Because if no one sees you, no one expects anything from you," she finally said. "No one criticizes you if you make a mistake. I just didn't want to disappoint anyone." These words hung in the air. Mrs. Carter looked at her intently and then sighed. "I understand," she said, "but you need to know, your talent is not something to be hidden. You are capable of more, Claire. You proved that today." Claire straightened up a bit, but her doubts were still evident in her eyes. "Even if that's true, what do I do with it?" The teacher smiled for the first time during the conversation. It was a warm, encouraging smile. "There are programs and competitions for students with abilities like yours. They allow you to develop, gain experience, and work with real challenges. I can help you apply. What do you say?" Claire felt her heart race. The idea of stepping out of her comfort zone was scary, but at the same time, it was exciting. She had never thought anyone would notice her abilities, let alone offer such an opportunity. I don't know," she honestly replied. "It seems so big." "And that's normal," Mrs. Carter said. "All big changes start with small steps. Think about it. But if you decide to try, know that I will support you." When Claire left the classroom, clutching her notebook tightly, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear, excitement, a slight sense of pride. This day had been nothing like she expected. But one thing was clear. Mrs. Carter had seen her, not as a student in the shadows, but as a person with potential. And for the first time, Claire wondered, what if she started seeing herself that way too? Claire returned home later than usual. The rest of the classes had passed in a blur. Her thoughts kept returning to the conversation with Mrs. Carter. The teacher's words echoed in her mind, like a soft voice calling her to something greater. She slowly opened the front door, greeted by the familiar comfort, the smell of dinner cooking, and the soft sound of news from the TV in the living room. Her mom peeked out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "You're late today, Claire. Is everything okay?" she asked, her gaze warm but slightly concerned. Claire nodded, put her backpack by the door, and walked into the kitchen. She sat at the table, not knowing how to start the conversation. Her dad, who had just returned from work, smiled at her from across the room. "How was your day, Claire?" he asked, filling a glass with water. Claire hesitated. Usually she would reply with something neutral like, "Fine," or "Nothing new." But today was different. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke. "Today in math class, I solved a complex equation. The whole class was watching, and even Mrs. Carter said I did well." Both parents looked at her in surprise. "Really?" That's amazing, dear, her mom exclaimed, sitting down next to her. You know how proud we are of you. Her dad smiled and added, That's impressive, Claire. What kind of equation was it? Claire quickly described the problem, though she knew her parents probably wouldn't understand the technical details, but their eyes shone with genuine admiration. She felt a warm, pleasant feeling growing inside her. Mrs. Carter said I have abilities, Claire continued, her voice a bit more confident. She suggested thinking about competitions and programs for students who are good at math. Her parents exchanged glances, their eyes filled with a mix of pride and excitement. That's a great idea, her mom said softly. You've always been so talented, but you never showed it. Maybe now is the time? It's a big step, her dad added, but sometimes those steps lead to something wonderful. Claire couldn't help but smile. She had expected her fears to be stronger, but her parents' support gave her confidence. At that moment, she realized she had already taken the first step. The next day, Claire went to school determined to talk to Mrs. Carter, but before she could do so, classmates began approaching her. It was a strange and new feeling, being the center of attention. Claire, that was amazing yesterday, said Laura, a girl who rarely even spoke to her. I didn't even know someone in our class could do that. You're a genius, added Josh, bouncing a ping-pong ball in his hand. Why didn't you show this before? Claire felt her cheeks flush. She wasn't used to praise. Usually her efforts went unnoticed, and this was part of her normal life. But now, hearing sincere words from her classmates, it felt unreal. I just never thought it mattered, she honestly replied, shrugging. It matters a lot, Laura exclaimed. I'm sure you could represent our school in competitions. Claire was surprised to hear these words. Mrs. Carter's words now echoed not only from a teacher's mouth, but also from her peers. It made her think, maybe it was worth the risk. During the break, Claire approached Mrs. Carter's office. In her room, filled with stacks of textbooks and diagrams on the walls, there was a small table with a packet of documents. The teacher greeted her with a warm smile. Claire, she began when the girl entered, I'm proud of your achievements, but I want you to know your victory in the competition is just the beginning. You have potential that shouldn't be limited to school boundaries. Claire sat across from her, her curiosity piqued. I found some new opportunities for you, Mrs. Carter continued, spreading out the documents. These are summer programs at universities, regional competitions, and even mentorship programs for talented students. Are you ready for the next step? Claire paused for a moment. On one hand, the idea of leaving the familiar world of school and venturing into a broader, unknown world was frightening, but she remembered that moment on the stage when she was awarded the diploma. She remembered how, for the first time, she felt that her abilities truly mattered. I'm ready, she confidently replied, nodding. In the following weeks, Claire fully immersed herself in her new routine. She began preparing for the regional competition, studying complex problems that Mrs. Carter brought to each session. Sometimes it was incredibly difficult, and she doubted she could handle it, but each time she found a solution, her confidence grew. The school library became her second home. Even those classmates who had never noticed her before now quietly greeted her and asked how she was doing. Laura and Josh, who had supported her after her first victory, became her new friends. They even started studying together, helping each other with problems. I never thought math could be interesting, Josh admitted one day, sitting at a table next to Claire. But when you explain it, it sounds cool. Claire smiled. She felt not just like a student, but like someone who could inspire others. The regional competition was approaching, and with each day her tension grew. The night before the event, sitting at the kitchen table with her parents, she finally shared her fears. What if I lose, she asked, looking down at her hands. What if everyone thinks my first win was just luck? Her mom placed a hand on her shoulder. Claire, no one expects perfection from you. We are proud of you for taking on this challenge. Her dad added, success isn't just about winning. It's about how you handle difficulties and keep moving forward. These words gave Claire a sense of peace. She knew her family and friends would support her, no matter the outcome. The regional competition became a new milestone in her life. This time, she not only solved all the problems, but also demonstrated an approach that impressed the judges. She didn't take first place, but she received a special prize for the originality of her solutions. When she returned to school, no one looked at her result as a failure. On the contrary, her classmates and teachers congratulated her, admiring her perseverance and talent. In the last weeks of the school year, Mrs. Carter suggested that Claire organize a small math club for those interested in solving complex problems. The girl agreed, and the club quickly gathered a group of enthusiasts. Now Claire was helping others, inspiring them just as Mrs. Carter had once inspired her. The club became a place where everyone could feel confident, ask questions, and learn from each other. Claire began to see that her path was not just about personal achievements, but also about helping others unlock their potential. When the final bell of the school year rang, Claire walked out of the school with a sense that she had changed. She was no longer the girl who hid at the back of the class, afraid to be noticed. Her journey ahead was long, filled with new challenges, but now she knew she was ready for them. Her story became a reminder for everyone. Each person has the potential to change not only their own life, but also the lives of others. And all it takes is one brave step forward.